And for this meeting, actually, Hitler for the first time used Oikodal, and it made him extremely euphoric. And there are reports about this meeting that Hitler talked for several hours non-stop without letting Mussolini say one single word. So this was, very, very clearly a drug-induced state that led to a result in a very important meeting that probably would have been very different if the two would have, sat together and rationally discussed.
Norman Ohler is a German New York Times best-selling author, novelist, and screenwriter. He is the author of a number of novels, such as Meth and Ponte City, as well as non-fiction books, The Bohemians and Blitzed, Drugs in Nazi Germany, which we're going to discuss today. Norman, welcome.
Very happy to be talking to you.
Not just Nazis and not just drugs, but Nazis on drugs. What an unbelievable way to open the 2024 season of the Smart Cookies podcast. And of course, what a deliciously demented topic in general. I mean, one would certainly think that these two terms are pretty much mutually exclusive, right? But your book not just proves otherwise, it kind of details how almost symbiotic the two actually were. But maybe before we go to tripping Wehrmacht soldiers and the story of Adolf, the drug addict, let's create just a little bit of a backdrop to the story. Nazis came to power in 1933, succeeding the infamous Weimar Republic, which they derided as being totally decadent with its cabaret shows, open attitudes towards sexuality, and flourishing of what they called degenerate art. But what did Nazis think of drugs and drug use in general?
Well, Nazis basically hated drugs because they connected drugs with the excesses of the Weimar Republic. And the Weimar Republic was not a system that they appreciated. The only drug that the Nazis, in fact, embraced was alcohol. They started to attempt to get into power in Germany already in the 20s. And this is the so-called beer hall putsch in Munich, where they were all drunk except Hitler, who never drank. And then in the morning, after a drunken night, they tried to take the Bavarian capital and miserably failed. So the Nazis, in fact, do come out of a drug. They come from beer drinking. But all the other drugs were highly suspicious to them.
I read that during the Nazi regime, a general principle was that neighbors were encouraged to denounce drug users. Is that true?
It is true. The anti-drug stance of the Nazi government was very important to their ideology, and they connected their anti-drug policy with their anti-Semitic policies, claiming that Jews in Germany were heavy drug users, were using more drugs than the non-Jewish German population. And the Nazi regime was not only an authoritarian regime, it was a totalitarian regime. So it tried to, get into the homes of each and everyone, trying to control and regulate individual, even intimate behavior, including sexual behavior and including, using narcotics or getting into some form of intoxication. So yes, they were encouraging on Germans to rat on each other.
What would happen to these people, to drug users, when they were busted? Would they force them into some sort of like mandated rehabilitation centers, or were they just shipped off to some work camp or something even worse? Do we know?
Well, they were sent usually to concentration camps. In the beginning, these concentration camps were not extermination camps yet, but they were, a new form of prison that was that was used for all types of people who would behave differently than the government desired them to behave. For example, if you were of a different political opinion, if you were a leftist or even a communist, you were sent to one of these concentration camps that were already starting in 1933. Or if you were using drugs, or if you were homosexual. For drug users, they had labels. So depending on what drug you used, you got a certain label. Like you could have the cocaine label or the opioid label. Basically, drug abuse was seen as morally degenerate behavior that should be punished.
Did they have like a classification? Which ones were the least offensive and which ones were the most offensive?
Well, they just labeled you. They didn't have like a ranking which drug is the worst. But the Nazis installed a countrywide regime of a drug control, like a drug control system. The doctors were supposed to actually inform the officials if anyone had a drug problem, and then the doctor had to say which drug problem it was.
Oh
So
no.
this
So the
is
doctors were snitching on their patients as well.
Yeah, which was quite unusual, or like it was novel, because before that, the usually there's a secrecy between doctor and patient that is
Yeah.
not to be breached by the government, but this was also changed by the Nazis. So doctors had to report on their patients if a drug problem or drug use was detected.
Which drugs did people use, for example, in the Weimar Republic the most? Was it cocaine? Did people smoke a little bit of weed? Was it something harder?
Weed was actually not so popular in Germany. Popular drugs were basically drugs that were normal medicines developed by German companies. For example, heroin was actually legal for a long time in Germany because it was developed by the German company Bayer, which also invented aspirin. For example, aspirin and heroin were the two top brands of the Bayer company. And we must
Bestsellers.
yeah, they were both bestsellers. The same chemist of the Bayer company actually found these two, or developed these two substances, these two medicines, aspirin and heroin, within the span of 10 days. Yeah, I would imagine that he would have gotten a raise, but I didn't find records about that. But he developed, this one person alone within 10 days developed two, extremely famous medicines or drugs. We have to understand that after the defeat in the First World War, from 1918 onwards, for actually until the Nazis took power in 1933, there were lots of morphine users in Germany, because many men came back from the front lines injured or had received morphine injections during the war and became addicted to morphine. So morphine or any opiates, were problems, or were widely used in the Weimar Republic. So the Nazis actually started to control this opiate use.
So even with veterans from the First World War, they could go like, oh, they're addicts off to the camps, or were they being a bit more lenient when it came to them and still provided morphine, or was there a way for them to get morphine legally?
Not really. I mean, it was quite harsh. That even former soldiers could be punished for still using morphine. I mean, when the Nazis took power, the war was already over for 15 years. So the attitude
Right.
was that by then you should have, overcome your pain or your problems. But in fact, many people, because opium or opiates are addictive, still were addicted and still were using it and had formed a habit. So these people were now suddenly being punished for it.
Okay, as you recount in the book, the tables eventually turn, and they turn quite dramatically. In a span of just a couple of years after they kind of take power in 1933, a big chunk of the population under the Nazi regime will not only get a bit stoned legally, they will get stoned legally on meth, out of all things. Could you please tell us the pretty batshit crazy chronicle of Pervitin?
Well, the Nazis never officially shifted their position on drugs, but the irony is that a very potent drug was then developed by a Berlin-based company, the Temmler company, which they branded as Pervitin, and the Pervitin was nothing else but methamphetamine. So the content of Pervitin was methamphetamine. It was developed by the head chemist of Temmler and patented in Germany in 1938, brought onto the market in 38. And this Pervitin was not seen as a drug. I mean, it was a normal medicine that you could buy even without a prescription in any pharmacy. Anyone could buy it over the counter, and because meth has such a unique, way of for functioning, it became quite notorious very quickly in Germany, and a lot of people started using it and started, to rely on this artificial energy boost that would help them to, stay on track or, perform well in the workplace. So Pervitin was kind of like the oil in the engine of the fascist society.
Wow. So, what kind of ailments was Pervitin supposed to cure or at least alleviate? Or was it just an energy boost, like you said?
The Temmler company wasn't sure at all because it was, for them also new. There was amphetamine called benzedrine on the market, which was, still on the market in the US in the later after the Second World War. But benzedrine was not so popular in Germany. Pervitin became very popular because Temmler made a huge ad campaign around it, a big marketing effort. They wrote letters to each doctor in Germany, sending each doctor 3 pills of Pervitin and asking the doctors to report back to them what the pills could be used for. And so the doctors tried them themselves and found that they, enhanced their mood and made them work more, longer hours. And so it was kind of unclear what Pervitin was supposed to be good for. So it was quickly seen as like a panacea, like something that's good for everything, basically. Then German universities became interested in it, and in the late 30s made the first studies on Pervitin, tried to find out what it actually does. And they, for example, found out that it reduces the need to sleep and that it reduces in higher dosages fear and anxiety and promotes self-confidence. So people thought it's actually great to use it. Negative side effects were not found by German universities at first.
So, from diarrhea to depression, people are like, let's go have some Pervitin.
Yeah, it was used by all segments of society. There was even a Pervitin-laced chocolate on the market, which contained quite a high amount of methamphetamine per individual small piece, and this was marketed especially for women. So women who had to stay home in the right-wing, Nazi regime had more fun cleaning the house, or had more energy to do the boring chores at home, while men would use it in the workplace mainly to perform better. It was also
Oh my
claimed
god.
that it increases libido, which is actually, I guess, true for crystal meth. That's why people take it also today now as a party drug and as a sex drug. So this was also, advertised or spoken about, that it would increase the libido, especially of the woman. which was a good thing for the dictatorship because they wanted to have wanted to create more Germans, more babies. So it seemed like crystal meth, which was not called crystal meth at the time, but simply methamphetamine or pavitine, seemed to have been like the perfect drug for a capitalist, performance-driven, modern society, which was Nazi Germany.
This is absolutely astounding. I mean, and if I remember correctly, people didn't even need prescription for the first couple of years, right?
Anyone could just walk into a pharmacy and buy as much pavitine as he or she wanted. Even children could buy it. Only the German health minister later then became skeptical of pavitine because he realized that it's quite a potent substance.
Right,
And in
right.
1939, you had to have a prescription from your doctor.
I mean, imagine going to your local pharmacy and getting some candy for your sore throat, a couple of band-aids, and then literally crystal meth for a really good time. I mean, people must have begun to use it recreationally as well, right? Are there any reports of pervitin parties in Nazi Germany? Like, I don't know, people bringing their own pills and then going to Grunewald forest to get bamboozled or something.
I didn't find any reports on that. Today we think of going to parties and taking pills or taking drugs, but at the time it wasn't like that. So Pevitine was not seen as this as a party drug or anything like that. It was more like drinking coffee, or it didn't have any aura of being like a drug. And also the nightlife was, especially when the war started, the nightlife in Germany was not as free anymore, not at all actually. Clubs had to close, and there were even dancing was prohibited at a certain point in time.
Oh my
So
God.
I think that the Pavitine was more used to kind of get by in the during your normal life. It was also used as an antidepressant or just to cope with your anxiety during a very extreme dictatorship.
It's just so difficult for me to wrap my head around this fact that if you change the word pervitin for crystal meth, which is what it is, and in our conversation, you just get a completely different picture of what was going on.
I mean, we also have to take into account that if we think of crystal meth today, we have a lot of horror images in our head that are the product of American propaganda, anti-drug propaganda. That with crystal meth, you're gonna lose your teeth and you're gonna become totally crazy. And I mean, all of these things are probably true if you consume black market crystal meth that was cooked up in some kind of Breaking Bad lab, or even worse, like some dude in some garage somewhere in the southern United States, makes this bottled. They make it in plastic bottles. They mix some kind of things, and then out comes crystal meth. I mean, it was not like this in Germany because the crystal meth that they consumed, I mean, the methamphetamine that the Germans consumed was made by the Temla company, so it was a very clean product. And each pill contained 3 milligrams of methamphetamine. So if you took one pill, the effect was not as strong as if you, for example, snort one line of crystal meth. The effect was more subtle. It was still a strong effect. And if you took 2 pills or 3 pills, you were pretty high. But still, the methamphetamine consumed orally from a pharmaceutical company is different than snorting black market crystal meth, which it's a little different, but basically it's the same substance.
Hmm. I have less respect for Walter White from Breaking Bad now, hearing that a German Walter White already existed, that and he made like premium grade crystal meth in the 30s.
I mean, Walter White was probably pretty good, but Fritz Hauschild, who invented methamphetamine, for sure was better because he also had better equipment, and he didn't have to run away like in a trailer or drive around some desert in where's Breaking Bad set
In New Mexico,
in New
in
Mexico,
Albuquerque.
right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
You did a lot of research in the German archives yourself for the book. Did you perhaps come up with any sort of a number about how many ordinary folks, occasionally dabbled or regularly purchased Pervitin during those years?
No, I found the production numbers, like how much was made, and the first actual consumer numbers that I found were dated from 1940 onwards, and they were the numbers that the German military reported. So these numbers are we know these numbers accurately. For example, for the attack on France, which started May 10th, 1940, 35 million dosages of methamphetamine were being used. So we know pretty well how many pills the German soldiers actually consumed.
Okay, but that's the military, right?
There are no numbers on the civilian population. At least I didn't find them, and I looked very carefully. Um, They're just the reports on how much money the company made with Pervitin and how much they produced and stuff like that. But I don't know, out of the 80 million Germans, how many actually used Pervitin. These numbers do not exist.
Hmm. Like you said, in 1939, I believe it was Leonardo Conti, the head of the Reich Health Office, expressed a bit of an alarm at the drug's addictive properties and moved to make it prescription only. I wonder, were there any like riots or protests on the streets of major cities or something? I mean, since meth is highly addictive, I imagine folks who were getting it for almost 2 years weren't all that happy that they were suddenly cut off.
Well, the interesting thing is that the numbers actually started rising after it became a prescription drug. So more people used it once it became a prescription drug. Which is something that also puzzled me. But I guess Pervitin became more and more known, and I guess doctors, just prescribed it when the people wanted it. So no one was cut off. You just had to uh, go to. You just had. It was just a little bit more difficult to obtain it because you had to get a prescription from your doctor. But that didn't seem to have stopped people from using it. To the contrary, they used it more after 1939 than before. You couldn't do riots anyhow in Nazi Germany because you would be
Right.
arrested immediately.
Right, makes sense. Okay, as you said, in any event, the order did not apply to the military. How did the love affair between the German army, the Wehrmacht, and major quantities of crystal meth begin?
Well, there was one guy responsible for it. His name is Otto Ranke. He was a German professor and the head of the so-called Physiological Institute of the German army. And he was responsible for performance enhancement of the soldier. So he was constantly looking for ways to improve the fighting capability of the German soldier before the war started. And when he read the first reports that methamphetamine um, prevents sleep or makes you able to stay awake longer, he thought that this might be of tactical advantage in a combat situation if your own men can fight for longer hours than the enemy, because every human being obviously gets tired in the evening. So he made tests in 1938 and 1939 at the medical academy of the German army with young medical officers. He gave them Pervitin and caffeine and placebos, and then checked out. These tests started at 8 in the evening and went all through the night until the next day in the afternoon. And he found that even the people who took caffeine at one point fell asleep, while the people on Pervitin actually didn't fall asleep and could stay awake easily for the whole night. And he concluded that this, would create an advantage for the German army in case they would, attack. So he proposed it to the Surgeon General, his superior, to supply Pervitin officially to the German troops, which his superior actually declined in the attack against Poland because he didn't understand it, or he didn't get it. But in the attack on Poland, which started World War II in September 1st, 1939, many German soldiers already had it kind of privately in their pockets and took it with them to the front. And this professor then made, he sent out questionnaires to divisions and said, did you use Pervitin? How was the effect? And many soldiers and commanders wrote back to him that it was actually beneficial for the so-called work that they did at the front lines, and backed with those reports that are now all stored in the German military archive, in which I read. Backed with those reports, he made another suggestion in the spring of 1940 to now officially supply the German army with methamphetamine before the attack against the West. And this time his superior actually greenlit the project, and then these millions of dosages were ordered from the Temna company and shipped to the German troops and distributed, and then they were being used from day one on. And Ranke actually wrote the so-called stimulant decree, which was an official guideline that every medical officer of the German army received, and it detailed, when an attack starts, when you take the methamphetamine, how many pills each soldier should take, after how many hours they should take the next pill, what are the side effects, and stuff like that.
What a great name, the stimulant decree.
This was actually the first time in military history that an army had such a stimulant decree, or had some kind of official regulation on a synthetic drug and its use. I mean, before, armies also had used drugs. Basically, since there's war, there's drugs in war. But these drugs that had been used before were somehow harmless compared to methamphetamine. They were, for example, alcohol or tobacco. So there have been regulations for armies before concerning, for example, alcohol, but never before had there been a regulation on such a potent substance.
Did they distribute Pervitin to ordinary soldiers, or to tank battalions and crews, or just to everybody who wanted it, or how did that work? Because it was for the purposes of the Blitzkrieg, right? So the soldiers could march or drive their tanks for longer.
Well, the problem with attacking the West was that the Western allies had more manpower and better weaponry. And to launch a successful invasion, you basically have to have superior manpower and weaponry, which the Germans didn't have. So the only way they could win this campaign was to surprise the enemy, the British and the French armies, by marching through the Ardennes Mountains within 3 days and 3 nights. That was the goal of the campaign, and therefore, advance so quickly into enemy territory that they would cut off the British and French armies that were in the north of Belgium, because they thought the Germans would attack there, and they were in the south of France. So the Ardennes Mountains are in the middle of these defense positions of the Allies. So the trick was to march through the mountains very quickly and not stop at night. And this was seen as basically impossible because you cannot stay awake for 3 days and 3 nights. And this was only possible because methamphetamine was used. So basically, the Blitzkrieg was a strategy to overpower an enemy that's more powerful than yourself by surprise. And this methamphetamine was kind of fueling this surprise tactical movement.
Were there any reports, or can we conclusively say that the drugs helped the German army advance so fast? Is there any way of us actually saying that with any degree of certainty?
Well, what got me interested was the sentence by one of the leading German historians, medicine historians, like he's into, the history of medicine, and this guy said that without methamphetamine, the Blitzkrieg is unthinkable. So I kind of tried to find what does that mean by studying all the reports, and we can actually see, and this goes back to your previous question, that the drugs were distributed in a way that would help the tank divisions to move very quickly, and this had never been done before in military history, that the tank divisions were leading the attack. Usually the tanks were kind of slowly coming after the men who stormed into enemy territory, and then the tanks were kind of backing up their advance. But the Germans used the tanks in the forefront, so the tanks were leading and speeding into enemy territory. And this was the big surprise to the Western Allies. They never thought that tanks could lead an attack, especially not through mountainous territory where tanks usually, were thought of as moving very slowly. But the Germans were using these tanks almost as like race cars. And the tank divisions were consuming the most methamphetamine. So we can see that the methamphetamine distribution was asymmetrical. Most of the meth went into the tank divisions, so the tanks were basically full on meth, and their behavior
Tripping.
became. Yeah, the tanks were. Well, I don't know if tripping is the right word, because I always connect tripping with the psychedelics, and I don't know if you're
Right,
tripping
right.
on meth, but certainly fueled. The tanks were certainly fueled by not only gasoline but also by crystal meth, and behaved, drove very quickly. The tank drivers behaved erratically, like they were not behaving like it is assumed in the military handbook. So the Allies were completely stunned by these very strange and quickly moving German tank divisions, and they would never have moved in this fashion without crystal meth. So crystal meth was, at least my research, I think, shows it one of the decisive factors. I mean, the whole idea of going through the Ardennes Mountains, that was the decisive idea, but the idea wouldn't have worked without methamphetamine. So without methamphetamine, the Western campaign would have been very different. And maybe Germany would have lost the Western campaign. It's not clear because it's speculation, but it would have been very different. And then, of course, the whole World War II would have been very different.
Did they repeat the exercise in the Eastern Front?
Yes, of course, because they were extremely successful on the Western Front. So they did the same thing on the Eastern Front when they attacked the Soviet Union, and had the same success in the beginning. The first 3 months showed huge victories and territory gains. And in October 1941, the German army was only a few kilometers west of Moscow. But then the winter came, and the the Blitzkrieg basically got stuck in the mud and then froze in the harsh winter conditions of Russia. And then the Pervitin actually wasn't so helpful anymore because they couldn't, use the extra energy to advance because the tanks just got stuck. And also the Russian defense was much better than the French defense. The Red Army actually put up a fight while the French quickly, gave up. So despite their successes in the beginning, it wasn't enough to beat the Soviet Union, and it dragged on into this year-long war. And in this year-long war against the Soviet Union, Pervitin was not really helpful anymore because Pervitin is only good for short periods of time. You can use it to stay awake even for 2-3 weeks. I mean, with occasional sleeping phases, but you cannot sustain such an energy level for 2-3 years. So then it backfires, and soldiers become depleted, depressed, addicted. And this is exactly what happened to the German army.
Now, the drug use was not limited to ordinary folks or soldiers. It reached all the way up to the very top. Hermann Göring, the chief of the Luftwaffe, the German Air Force, was a notorious morphine addict. And of course, even Hitler, who was otherwise. As you said, he didn't drink booze, he was a vegetarian, presented himself as a celibate man almost. And as far as we know, didn't have any previous experience with drugs. He himself became, should we say, infatuated with or even addicted to drugs. But maybe let's spend a moment talking about the man who introduced these substances to him first, his personal doctor, Theo Morell. Who was he?
Morell was an overweight, avant-gardistic VIP doctor in Berlin in the 30s. And he had a somewhat well-going practice on the main boulevard of Berlin, attracting wealthy patients that basically had no disease but wanted to feel better. Or actresses would go to this guy before they had to go on stage, and he would give them mood enhancing medicines. So he was kind of a Dr. Feelgood, not really a quack, but not really a serious doctor. So he was kind of an unusual guy at the time, because there were not these doctors that then, became quite fashionable. For example, in the United States in the 50s and 60s, were not so, this kind of doctoring was not so known at the time. But Morell was this kind of a doctor. So, and he believed in vitamins. He was a vitamin specialist, and vitamins also were not known really at the time. So he would give his patients injections of vitamin C, for example, intravenous injections of vitamin C or other vitamins. And these injections actually led to a boost in the mood, or also in performance. And he treated one man called Hoffmann, who was the photographer of Hitler. And Hoffmann thought that this is a great guy, and then introduced Hitler and Morell to each other. And Hitler had suffered for years from stomach cramps. This was in 1936 when they met for the first time. And Morell then gave Hitler his first injections, and Hitler loved these injections, and quickly appointed Morell as his personal physician, and then in a way became addicted to these almost daily injections. So Morell gave Hitler thousands of injections in the course of the 9 years that they spent together. They became good friends, and Morell was probably the man that Hitler talked to or consulted with the most. Many people were in the higher echelon of the Nazi regime were very suspicious of this guy because he was, a bit weird or a bit unusual. And he was around Hitler all the time, and he gave him these vitamin injections all the time. So in the beginning, he didn't give Hitler hardcore drugs, but he gave him vitamins, and this actually helped Hitler's health for quite a while. He never became ill. He was always in good shape, and his belief in his doctor was basically limitless.
When did he start to add a little bit more than just vitamins to Hitler's injections? And what were these substances?
This started in August 1941. This was the first time that Hitler became ill since he met Morell. So in the first time he became ill in 5 years. He had the so-called Russian flu, which is basically a very severe flu, which made him stay in bed in a critical phase of the campaign against the Soviet Union. So he couldn't go to the military briefing, and Hitler was very skeptical always of his generals. He always thought that they um, make bad decisions. So he asked Morell to give him something stronger than vitamins so he could attend the daily military briefing. And for the first time, then Morell gives him more than just vitamins. He gives him Dolantin, which is an opioid, a German a brand made by a German company. And he injects this opioid into Hitler, and Hitler immediately feels better because these opioids are very strong, act very strong, very powerful agents. So Hitler could actually go to the military briefing. He was quite impressed by this medicine, and asks for it more and more often until in 1943 he receives for the first time an even stronger opioid, which was called Oikodal, which is today known as oxycodone, which is the very opioid that created the opioid crisis in the United States. So this had been a German product before the end of the war. And Hitler really gets addicted to this Oikodal opioid in 1944 and uses it in quite high quantities, 20 milligrams per injection, during some phases of the war every second day. So that's a very typical behavior of an addict, basically.
Did it stop there, or did Hitler start receiving even more potent drugs even more regularly? How did this addiction then spiral?
Oikodal is the most potent drug you can take. I mean, if you inject 20 milligrams intravenously of Oikodal, then you experience the strongest high that you can imagine. It's a stronger high than heroin. So this
Oh my
was
God.
this was already a peak experience for Hitler. Um, but he also took, he then became, he started liking potent substances, and he also consumed other things like
I bet he did.
hormone. Morell was very experimental with substances, and he gave Hitler quite a lot of hormone injections, which he thought, and Hitler thought as well, that they would boost his immune system, even though they did actually the opposite. Then there was a time after the bomb attack against Hitler on July 20th, 1944, which left Hitler quite injured. His eardrums were blown, and he had received many wood splinters into his body. And after that, that attack by Stauffenberg on July 20th, 1944, the so-called Operation Valkyrie, Hitler started using also cocaine for until October. So from end of July till October, he regularly consumed cocaine against the pain in his ears, and so he became basically polytoxic, manic drug user, and he loved to experiment with all kinds of things. But Eukodal, the very potent opioid, stayed his favorite drug until the end.
So basically, he was receiving oxy and cocaine, what, on a daily basis or every second day, or?
After the Operation Valkyrie, he received cocaine on a daily basis, and then oxy every other day. So that was a pretty, drug intense phase of the dictator's life. It was basically what later was called speedball. If you consume an upper, which is cocaine, and a downer, which is an opioid at the same time, you have like very strong drug experience. So Hitler basically removed himself more and more from reality and moved into artificial worlds where his mood was still somehow intact despite the catastrophic, news that he received from his generals from the front.
I mean, it's kind of mental that because Hitler was a bit gassy in the beginning, he ended up becoming basically a full-blown drug addict. Did no one in Hitler's inner circle connect the dots kind of between Hitler's taking these injections and his sudden outburst of energy and elevated mood, as you put it?
Well, people did become quite suspicious of Morell, especially after 1943. There are more and more critical reports that I found on the doctor, because Morell would never disclose what he gave Hitler. And Hitler's health, which had been quite good until 1941, 42, started to shift. And at the same time, like in 42, 43, the success of the German army started to stop. So, because Hitler made more and more irrational and catastrophic decisions, actually, while before, until 1942, he was quite successful. So no one questioned anything. But people started questioning, especially after the defeat in Stalingrad, which was a turning point in the Second World War, and and it was hard to criticize Hitler himself, because you quickly ended up dead if you criticized the leader, the Führer. But you could criticize Morell, so Morell got more and more of the blame. And for example, Goebbels, the minister for propaganda, he became quite skeptical of Morell. And Himmler, the head of the SS, became very skeptical and critical of Morell. And they actually tried to remove Morell from Hitler, but Hitler stuck to his personal physician until the end. And I mean, Hitler called the shots, so all the attempts to remove Morell were unsuccessful.
Are there some instances when you can pinpoint exact moments when you believe Hitler's drug use contributed to poor or even, as you said, erratic decision making that proved detrimental to the war effort? Or was it just a general decline from 1942 onwards?
Well, fortunately, the notes that Morell left, and which are stored in the Federal Archives of Germany now, are quite elaborate and precise, so we can connect certain decisions, or we can say that certain decisions were made while Hitler was on certain drugs. And obviously, we cannot prove that without the drugs he would have, come to a different decision. But we can say that we can see and prove that, for example, his decision in the fall of 1944 to launch a second offensive in the West, the so-called Second Ardennes offensive, which was catastrophic for the German army. He made this decision against all, military judgment and, against reality, basically, while he was high on cocaine. And obviously, we know that cocaine changes your decision making. It makes you overconfident. So in that case, that was a very bad decision. I mean, the better decision would have been to, secure positions and retreats, and he did like he did the opposite. He said we have to go into the offensive again, and you don't go into the offensive if you don't have the military means to do so. And the German generals were shocked when he announced in late October 1944 that they would go into the offensive again in the West against the advancing United States Army. So this was you can link this decision, which basically led to the final defeat of the so-called Third Reich, to the cocaine use. Or another example is a decisive meeting he had with Mussolini, the Italian dictator who was his closest ally. He met him for a meeting in July 1943 when Mussolini wanted to talk with Hitler about ending the war, about making a truce with the West. And because Mussolini actually wanted to break away, he wanted to stop the war basically because he saw that it was a lost cause. And for this meeting, actually, Hitler for the first time used Oikodal, and it made him extremely euphoric. And there are reports about this meeting that Hitler talked for several hours non-stop without letting Mussolini say one single word. So this was, very, very clearly a drug-induced state that led to a result in a very important meeting that probably would have been very different if the two would have, sat together and rationally discussed the situation on the battlefield.
A Hitler moving units that don't exist anymore on the map is, of course, immortalized in the movie Der Untergang, or The Downfall, but they don't show any drug use there, of course. Did Hitler take drugs up until the end, up until his suicide in the bunker in Berlin?
Well, I think this is one of the big problems of this movie, that it doesn't show Hitler's drug use and therefore cannot really explain Hitler's behavior at all. So that's why the movie is not really accurate. But it is actually quite interesting what happens in the bunker, where the movie also is set, and it focuses on these times in the bunker. The bunker into which Hitler moved in January 1945 under his office in Berlin only had 2 bedrooms. So only Hitler had a bedroom and his doctor Morell. All the other, high Nazis were not staying in the bunker. So it kind of sheds a light already on what Hitler prioritized there. He only took, he didn't take Himmler or Goebbels or Goering into the bunker. He took Morell into his bunker. So his doctor would be next to him and could supply him at all times. And Morell's reports from this time are quite interesting because he has problems finding the drugs that Hitler has become addicted to, because the Allies, especially the British, started bombing German pharmaceutical companies late in the war. And in December 1944, the Merck company, who produced Oikodal, was completely destroyed. And suddenly supplies ran out even for Hitler. And Morell then hops on a motorcycle, which is quite unusual for him because, as I stated before, he was quite overweight. And he drives on a motorcycle through bombed out Berlin, driving from pharmacy to pharmacy to try to find the medicines or the drugs that his patient A, as he called Hitler in his notes, needed. So also the bunker time was quite an intense pharmaceutical episode.
I just have a couple of questions left. A lot of historians are convinced that Hitler suffered from Parkinson's disease. That bit is kind of implied in the movie with the Hitler's famous shakes behind his back. Do you think the deteriorating mental state was a result of the disease or long-term drug use, or both?
Well, Morell was a trained doctor, so he knew what Parkinson's is, obviously, and he always writes when Hitler has a disease. He always writes it in his notes. He never writes that Hitler has Parkinson's, and he never gives Hitler any drugs that you give to a Parkinson's patient. So I think that historians later on interpreted the shaking of Hitler as Parkinson's because they didn't have, the information, or didn't look for the information that the shaking was actually, the tremor was actually coming from withdrawal from opioids, which I think is a more plausible explanation. I mean, he could have had Parkinson's also, and maybe Morell didn't detect it. It's possible, but I think it's more plausible that this comes from drug withdrawal.
What happened to Morell after Hitler's suicide?
Well, Goebbels became more and more skeptical of Morell, and has a conversation with Hitler. Basically, he's telling Hitler that Morell made him addicted to opioids, and that's where his failing health is now coming from. And Hitler at one point must have believed Goebbels, because on April, I think it was the 22nd, a few days before he committed suicide, he fired Morell, yelling at him, "You have been giving me opioids all the time. Turned me into a drug addict. Get the hell out of the bunker." And he actually pointed a gun at Morell, but he didn't shoot it. But
Oh,
he did send Morell out of the bunker, and then Morell manages to catch one of the last planes out of destroyed Berlin and flies to Bavaria, where he had kept a private lab all these years. And he goes into this lab and basically stays there until the end of the war, and stays there also in May 1945, when the Americans start occupying Bavaria, and then arrest Morell, and then question Morell for quite a long time. Like, he stays in American custody for over a year, because the Americans try to figure out whether he's also a war criminal, whether they should put him on trial in Nuremberg, which they don't, because the only crime, if crime is the right word, that Morell committed was that he, gave drugs to Hitler. And so maybe he was even a hero in a way, because he destroyed Hitler's health involuntarily. So the Americans never put him on trial. They just, once they're done with him, once they're done interrogating him, they drive him to the Munich train station, and dump him outside the Munich train station, and just leave him there.
and he lives out the rest of his life as a practicing doctor somewhere around Munich, or
I guess the Americans didn't treat him very well during custody, and he was not doing, his health was not very good when they dumped him outside the Munich train station. He claimed later on that they actually tortured him, that they removed his fingernails and toenails so he would talk. But this, I don't know if that's true. That's only what he claimed. And he actually dies in a hospital in Bavaria a few months after the Americans release him. So he never recovers from the American custody fully. He died in his late 50s.
last question. At the end, we come to the very tricky subject of responsibility. Maybe less in the case of Hitler, since he detailed his ideas and plans already in Mein Kampf, which was published in 1925, long before he even met Theo Morell. But if indeed, as you said, large chunks of population found themselves in a chemically altered state, the case of diminished collective responsibility could potentially be made. How do you deal with that?
I don't really see how this case can be made. I mean, if you look at the law, and my father was quite a high judge in Germany, and I spoke with him at length about this. And he said that if you commit a crime under the influence of a narcotic, for example, under the influence of methamphetamine, um, it does not really lessen your responsibility. Um, the only way it would be lessened was if you were planning a crime while you were intoxicated and you didn't really know what you were doing at all. But even if you like plan a murder and then you commit the murder while you are on methamphetamine, it does not, get you off the hook at all, actually. That's at least how the German law works. And this is also how I feel. I mean, the perpetrators during the so-called Third Reich, they always knew what they were doing. And if you're on crystal meth, you know what you're doing. I mean, it's not that you're like, I mean, if you drink a lot of alcohol, there might be a point where you don't know exactly anymore what you're doing, but the effect of crystal meth is quite different. You're always very clear in your head. You can think, very clearly, actually. So to me, it does not lessen responsibility at all, actually. And as you said, the Nazi ideas and ideology was formed without, the use of drugs. Um, it was pre-drug, and let's say you have a concentration camp guard who has to, make it through his 12-hour shift. I mean, he's a concentration camp guard. He knows what's going on in the concentration camp. It does not lessen his responsibility if he uses pervitin, so he could be on a higher alert during his shift. I don't actually see this argument at all.
Right. I think maybe a lot of the confusion comes from, like you said before, the American sort of campaign against these drugs, because I also thought that crystal meth makes you trip like a psychedelic or something.
No, I guess with the psychedelic it would be different. If you take a strong psychedelic and you kind of actually don't know anymore what you're doing, even though also on psychedelics, I mean, usually you're even more clear of what you're doing than.
Yeah, it's an interesting discussion. Norman, thank you so much. This was a fascinating, absolutely fascinating conversation. I wish we could talk even more. I really urge everybody to get Blitzed. It's such a fantastic read. Where can people get it? I'm assuming all fine e-bookstores everywhere, right?
Yeah, I think you can get it in each bookshop.
Do you have any social media that you would like to put out there where people can follow your work?
Yeah, I guess on Instagram you can follow me on Norman Ohler. Um, but I think the best is not to use social media and just read books. So you don't need to follow me. You can just read the
You're
books.
you're not the first guest to say that. All right. And what are you working on right now? I hear you're working on something super interesting again.
I am interested in psychedelic substances, actually, and I was looking at LSD in particular because um, I read reports that LSD can be beneficial against dementia, for example, and dementia is one of the pressing problems of the near future. So I was curious about the question of why LSD actually became illegal, and I researched the very early history of LSD. It was developed in 1943, and the Swiss company who developed it, Sandoz, which today is Novartis, they made some crucial decisions in the mid and late 40s and early 50s, which actually made the whole the whole group of psychedelic substances illegal. Things happened in America that are actually very interesting to research, and so this is my new book, and it's called Tripped in English, and it will appear in the US in April 24.
All right. I really hope we get to talk about it once
Why
you
not?
release the book. It was an absolute pleasure. Thank you, Norman.
Pleasure's on my side. I also thank you for the interest, and have a good day.
Oi! Thank you for listening to the episode. If you've enjoyed it, please subscribe and follow on YouTube, Apple Podcasts, and Spotify. As always, eternal glory and gratitude to my producers who are supporting this show on Patreon, the kings and queens, Gordan, Jurechuk, Lorenzo, Veronica, Mila, Carmen, and Taichi. Without you, this pod would not have been possible at all. If you'd like to become a certified Tovarish or Tovarishica of the show too, head to Patreon, find Smart Cookies podcast on there, and become one. It's as simple as that. Thank you.